one of the things that does emerge over the course of the 9 months of photographs is the transformation of the landscape. As things were removed, as the pile got lower, as you say, it's a 7-story or more pile at the beginning, and it goes down 7 stories to bedrock. You're facing a new landscape on a regular basis. What's the continuity and what's the difference in what emerges over the course of that time?
The sense of the space that housed the World Trade Center and its fellow buildings was quite emphatic by the slurry wall's existence. The slurry wall saved Lower Manhattan. It not only held the river out for when they built the buildings, but it held the river out when the buildings fell. Because I don't know if you know this, but somewhere in November, the south slurry wall started to move. They were fearful it was going to collapse, and if it did, and the west slurry wall did too, then the Hudson River would have flooded Lower Manhattan. Because you're, 80 feet or so, 70 feet or so below the river level. And it held, and they put in all those tiebacks to keep it in place, and it was a massive operation. So there was this heroic component that defined the space, and it kept on getting clearer and clearer. And every day that I was down there, I found myself faced with the issue of how do I photograph this thing? It's a passive thing, just a wall sitting there with all these punctures in it. And yet its monolithic power reminded me of the pyramids. Even though it had no shape except to be a square, basically, it had the same kind of sensation. If you stood up against it or within, a certain distance from it and looked up, it blocked out everything except the tips of a few skyscrapers over the top. So it had this monumental quality. And it was the problem that I faced photographically. The place was less and less interesting, and yet it had this powerful feature in it. How do I state that? How do I photograph it? And I kept on feeling, every day that I was down there, I kept on thinking, someday, when they rebuild this site, a piece of this wall has to be visible to everyone so they could feel this. And I'm so pleased that in the Memorial Museum, the wall will be there. And I saw it last week. I was able to go down to bedrock and walk around in the construction, and I came upon the wall, and I just, and sitting next to the wall was the last column in its own house. And I just burst into tears. To see them again together was to remember. So, I can't even say it was to remember. It was to feel again that same sensation of seeing the last column against the wall. It put me back there, and I know it's going to work for visitors by the millions. They're going to get a sense of, what this experience must have been like.
I do want to come to the last column because you document the removal of it at the end of the book. But it does strike me that as you are describing what you saw at the World Trade Center site, that many of the references you make are classical references or to antiquity. You're talking about the Sphinx. You're talking about, in the book, Rembrandt's Night Watch as an image that occurred to you in that removal of the 5 firefighters from the North Tower staircase. And so it seems that there are these archetypes from ancient history that recur in a moment like this of enormous tragedy, of enormous strain and loss, when all of the emotions are, in some sense, purified or reduced to their essence, that we return to the same kinds of feelings or references that have recurred through the course of history. And so you're back in documenting this process at Ground Zero. You're back to a moment that is reminiscent in its essence of the construction of the pyramids and so many other things that are marked as turning points in history?
It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? I mean, we're human beings living on the planet. Things happen to us in any century that are going to be similar because we're human, because we have endeavored to make something or to remind ourselves or to celebrate or to grieve. I mean, we're just human. And so throughout history, these similar events have occurred. Not necessarily the destruction of something, but certainly we know biblically the destruction of cities, and history tells us about that. So I think people have recognized these singular moments in time that have been somehow painted or sculpted into a kind of artifact that takes us back to it. It's a reference point to some human event. And certainly, as a reader of art history for all of my life, here and there, I recognized, oh my God, of course, this is not unlike something. I've seen this before. Where have I seen this before? We reference these things so easily.